Guys, how you doing? This is our post-service recap video for this morning, which is October the 4th, 2020. We're almost through 2020. Just October, November, December, and then I think it's going to start over again, and then we'll be done. But just another 14 or 15 months or so, and then we'll be through this year. I got the fireplace on because it's so dreadful outside. But we had a nice service inside at Regina Street, and we talked about worship. We started out having some music, just focusing our attention, our thoughts, our hearts towards God, and then from there allowing each of us space to kind of make a contribution, share the thing that God wanted us to share. So lots of prayers being thrown out, and just an encouraging time. Some encouraging testimonies were put forward. And then we had a talk about worship. What is it? What are we doing when we worship? How do we know we're worshiping? And all that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that we talked about is that worship biblically is a very political action. It has to do with a declaration of the king, a declaration of who has power. And that's an Old Testament theme, but it's also a New Testament one. So if you remember the story, certainly in Matthew's gospel of the three wise men, the three magi, they're coming to see the Messiah, to see the King of the Jews. And that really upsets the current king, whose name is Herod. And that's the reason that Herod gets really upset with Jesus right off the bat, is because his power is threatened. But the Magi are there to worship Jesus. And so there's this linking together of the idea of kingship, sovereignty, power with worship. And then if you look at the Old Testament, throughout you'll see this idea of like the kingship of God, the sovereignty of God. In Micah, God is described as being on the highest of mountains, and all the nations are going to come before him to give their praises, to serve him. And in Exodus, we see this idea that Moses is called to go before Pharaoh so that Pharaoh would release God's people so that they could go to the mountain and worship the Lord. Now, one of the interesting things about the language in Exodus is that the same Hebrew word, which is the word avad, is translated as worship and as serve. So another way that we can read that verse in Exodus is that Moses wants God's people to be let free so they can go to the mountain and serve the Lord. And so I would suggest that worship, at least part of what worship is serving God. To worship God is to serve God. To serve God is to worship God. And that's, of course, not always what we're talking about when we talk about worship. Lots of times we're talking about music and instruments and singing and so on. And singing, I think, is a way that we declare God's power, we declare God's service, but it's not the only way that we declare God's service or God's power and our service to him. So some people had some other ideas that came to mind when they were talking about worshiping God. It's about honoring God. It's about acknowledging God, acknowledging the power of God. It's about the fear of the Lord. It's about being made low, lowering ourselves so that God can be exalted, or being humble before God. It's about adoration before God. It's about submission to God, and so on. But this idea of serving God, this idea of to worship God is to serve God, really calls out the fact that we can serve lots of things. We can serve different things, and we're not always serving God. In fact, the things that have power over us, the things that have power in our lives, are things that we can serve, which is to say they are things that we can worship. And lots of times those are good things. We can worship good things. Family, marriage, kids, finances, and so on. But those things will never deliver, they will never save in the way that only God can deliver or save. And so the question before us is, how do we ensure that we are serving God alone and not being distracted by serving other things? How do we ensure that it is God alone who has power over us and not these other things that have power over us? And so I think that's a question that we constantly work out through our lives, that we constantly wrestle with through our lives. One of the things that someone suggested this week that I think is a good practical thing that we can try is just when we wake up in the morning, that we would give those first thoughts, our first breath to God. Even if it's just a simple little statement. As we wake up, we just say, God, you are good. God, you are in control. God, you are king. And then we go about our day. We're at least starting our day with an orientation where God is the one who has power. We're starting our day with a declaration of God's power. And our intention would be that the entirety of our day stays in alignment with the will of the Lord. And so we're going to try that this week. We're going to talk about it next week. Next week, Thanksgiving. If you haven't been here yet, come on out. We'll have Thanksgiving together. And there'll be no turkey or anything like that. It'll actually be a pretty regular church service, but it'll happen to be on Thanksgiving Sunday. If you don't come out, have a great Thanksgiving weekend, and bless you. And I think that's it. Fire's burning, guys. Okay. Amen.